trying to let in as many immigrants as possible. More for the Democrats, more is better and less is racist.
Just astonishing. And the statement that Greg Abbott put out is really feisty stuff. He said the federal government has broken the contract between the United States and the state of Texas. And the eye numbers, Greg, are simply eye-watering. 6 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border in just 3 years, Governor Abbott says. That's more than the population of 33 states in the United States. Astonishing numbers. And
Martin, that's just Texas. If you add Arizona and other border states, you know, it's pushing 10 million. By the end of Biden's term, it'll be 11 million. A study by Yale University a few weeks ago, 3 very liberal professors that did the study estimate there's 22 million illegal aliens. So this is a crisis that was created by Biden. It's what he wants. They want unfettered access to the border. They're letting them in. It's a real hardship on the working people of Texas and other border states. And now it's a real hardship on cities that the federal government, as well as the governors of Texas and other states, are sending some of the migrants to those so-called sanctuary cities.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, not now just the Rochdale Labour candidate, but now a former MP for Lancashire who's standing again, has been suspended by the Labour Party for making statements considered to be anti-Semitic. We ask, has the Labour Party changed? We'll also tonight talk about Braverman's Law. Yes, that piece of legislation, the Illegal Migration Act, which, given the law of unintended consequences, has now left 22,000 people who came last summer in a position where we don't know quite what to do with them. And I'm going to react on Rishi Sunak's performance last night, live for 1 hour in front of that audience on GB News. Did he do enough to convince people there might just be a way back for the Conservative Party under his leadership? But all of that comes after the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB Newsroom tonight is that a former Labour MP who's seeking re-election has been administratively suspended from the Labour Party pending an investigation over anti-Semitic remarks he allegedly made at a party meeting. The Jewish Labour movement has strongly condemned comments Graham Jones reportedly made about British-Israeli Jews, saying they were appalling and unacceptable. And that comes after Sir Keir Starmer withdrew his party support for another candidate, Azhar Ali, who was recorded suggesting Israel had used the Hamas attack of October the 7th as a pretext to invade Gaza. Sir Keir insists his party has changed under his leadership.
Well, those comments were appalling, and that is why we took decisive action. It is virtually unprecedented to withdraw support for a candidate in the way that I withdrew support for this candidate yesterday. That's what a changed Labour Party is all about. And of course, any allegation will be fully investigated by the party. But the important thing is the decisive action that's been taken to make it absolutely clear that this is a changed Labour Party.
Sir Keir Starmer. But Conservative Minister Grant Shapps says Labour have no justification for allegations of anti-Semitism in their party.
I think Starmer's been taking the public for fools. He's supported and promoted a candidate who has expressed the most atrocious racism against Jewish people. And Starmer hasn't acted out of some sort of principle. He's acted out of really political expediency now and just said, OK, well, we're going to chop him, but only once the media pressure became too much.
Now, the government's looking closely at the option of bringing injured children from Gaza to the UK for medical treatment. Lord Cameron has revealed there is the possibility of transferring some children to British hospitals, including Great Ormond Street. However, the Foreign Secretary reiterated to the House of Lords earlier on today that initial efforts are focused on providing medical assistance to Palestinians in the region itself. Employers and landlords who allow illegal migrants to work for them or rent their properties will face much tougher penalties from today. The fines for such actions have risen to a maximum of £45,000 per worker for a first breach. Landlords also now face increased penalties of £5,000 per lodger and £10,000 per occupier for a first breach. Ministers believe the crackdown will help reduce the incentives for illegal migrants crossing into the UK. And the incredibly sad news today that the veteran BBC broadcaster Steve Wright, who presented on Radio 1 and Radio 2 for more than 4 decades, has died at the age of 69. The BBC Director General Tim Davie described him as a truly wonderful broadcaster and the ultimate professional. Online tributes have also flooded in from fellow DJs Sarah Cox, Simon Mayo, Ken Bruce and Tony Blackburn. And the impressionist Rory Bremner said it was an awful shock, but saluted Steve's energy and professionalism. Steve Wright, who died today at the age of 69. For the very latest stories, do sign up for GB News Alerts. Scan the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Well, last night on this show, I said I found it extraordinary that Azhar Ali still had the confidence and support of the Labour Party. I couldn't imagine any other party keeping somebody who'd said what he'd said. Let's remind ourselves what he said in October to the Lancashire Labour Party, and this was from the Daily Mail.
The Egyptians are saying that they warned Israel 10 days earlier. 2 weeks ago. Right, 2 weeks earlier. Americans warned them 2 weeks before. A day before. There's something's happening. Right? Netanyahu, right, deliberately, he was in political trouble. He's in, he's in political trouble. He cashed it. They deliberately, I believe that, and I've said it publicly. They deliberately took the security off. Yeah. They allowed the massacre, and it was a massacre of 1,200 innocent people, right? They allowed that massacre, and that gives them the green light to do whatever they bloody want.
Well, there you are. I mean, the idea that the Israeli government would allow a massacre of their own people is quite beyond the realms. But there we are. That was what he said. Initially, the Labour Party supported him, but the Daily Mail went to Starmer yesterday with yet more from that speech. What was extraordinary was the lack of protest in that Labour Party meeting to what he said, and we'll come to that a little bit later on. But today, Starmer decided, well, in fact, last night, but today Starmer said this.
Well, those comments were appalling. And that is why we took decisive action. It is virtually unprecedented to withdraw support for a candidate in the way that I withdrew support for this candidate yesterday. That's what a changed Labour Party is all about. And of course, any allegation will be fully investigated by the party. But the important thing is the decisive action that's being taken to make it absolutely clear that this is a changed Labour Party.
This is a changed Labour Party, but that's not what Rishi Sunak thought when he spoke to GB News' People's Forum last night.
The Labour Party hasn't changed. It's not change, it's a con, right? And that's what you have to remember. A vote for anyone who's not me, who's not your Conservative candidate, is a vote to put him, with his values and his party, in power.
Well, I have to say, I think, to be honest, and I've said this for a long time, that I do believe that Starmer's main achievement has been to try to neutralise and drive out the very, very hard left, to make the Labour Party far less scary. And goodness me, it began, of course, with Jeremy Corbyn, who can't stand as a candidate. Diane Abbott was suspended for saying Irish people, Jews and travellers did not experience racism. And the list goes on and on. Kate Osamore, and there was another one this afternoon, and we'll come to that in a moment. But has the Labour Party changed? Well, you know what? It has changed a bit, but it can't afford to change completely, because my view is if they were to suspend and get rid of everybody that was deeply critical of Israel, I think there wouldn't be almost anybody left in the modern-day Labour Party. But I'd love to hear your views. Farage@gbnews.com. And I'm joined by Matthew Larser, former senior advisor to the former Labour Party leader Ed Miliband, and Max Young, reporter at the Guido Fawkes News website, who've been very involved with a story today about the Labour Party. I now think that this by-election in Rochdale is one of the most extraordinary and fascinating by-elections. It happens at the end of this month, and yes, of course, we've got 2 by-elections coming this week, and there's a fair bit of focus on Wellingborough in particular. But I somehow now think Rochdale could be a very big clue to the future. Matthew Larser, the Labour Party candidate will still appear on the ballot paper as the Labour Party candidate. Some people have already voted for him on post, which is unfortunate.
Yes, I'm very unfortunate.
But knowing that the party have withdrawn support, potential Labour voters start to look to go elsewhere. Where might they go?
Well, I think they'll split, Nigel. I mean, I think that I'm afraid it will be a fairly election along fairly racial lines in Rochdale, which is a town that's had racial conflict before, as has nearby Oldham. There were riots there back in the north. Back in the absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think what will happen is that the white working class vote will splinter off to Simon Danczuk, who's the former Labour MP who's standing for reform, who left the Labour Party because of a little personal scandal, which is sort of texting somebody who shouldn't. Absolutely. But he was a fierce critic, of course, of Jeremy Corbyn's. I've known Simon
very much a
since we were in the
moderate.
Young Socialists together. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, therefore, what he will have is an appeal to a kind of traditional white working class vote, and then the Muslim vote will split between Galloway and the now suspended Labour candidate.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the literature that Galloway's been putting out, it's Gaza, Gaza, Gaza.
Yeah.
If you look at what Danczuk is saying today, it's I will put Rochdale ahead of Gaza. It's a fascinating contest. I wondered, Max, what your thought on this was. Rochdale as a by-election.
Well, I think it's going to be fireworks to come. Simon's whole pivot towards let's talk about Rochdale, not Gaza, will, I think, go down very well. Galloway is racing up when it comes to the bookies, and Labour are not the favourites anymore as of today. So that's interesting to see.
Ex-Labour.
I think that everything could change in the next 2 weeks, and it's all to play for.
It is, and of course, if Galloway was to win, if he was to win, the longer-term implications for Labour are quite serious.
Well, I think actually, the thing about Rochdale is he won the Bradford by-election when I was working for 2012. Yeah, when I was, in the Ed Miliband era. But that was a constituency which I think was either majority Muslim or kind of 40-odd percent-ish, something like that.
This is less than that.
This is less than that, absolutely. Yeah. And there's also a couple of posh bits of Rochdale which are in the constituency which might still vote Tory, and there's a bit sort of more boho, a bit more public service workers who might think, what on earth do? I don't want to vote for Simon because it's not my kind of Labour. Will they splinter? Will a few of them vote Lib Dem? And because the Lib Dems, of course, used to have half of it used to be in a Lib Dem seat. Yeah. So, I mean, Rochdale, of course, was the first ever television election. It was the first election in the 50s televised, where the count was televised. Ludovic Kennedy was the candidate. I think it's going to have as much attention this time as it did when it was the first insight that people at home got through there.
I thought I knew a fair bit about political history, but I've got to say, Matthew Larser, you've got me on that one. I'm very, very pleased to hear it. Right, now, I have to, for legal reasons, now tell you all of the candidates that are standing in the upcoming Rochdale by-election. Azza Ali, still on the paper as the Labour Party without the official endorsement. Mark Coleman, Independent. Simon Danczuk, Reform UK. Ian Donaldson, Liberal Democrat. Paul Ellison, Conservative. George Galloway, Workers' Party of Britain. Michael Houth, Independent. William Houth, Independent. Guy Otten for the Green Party, who I understand has also lost the support of the Green Party. Raving Rodent Subordinate, official monster raving loony party, and David Tully, Independent. And I have to do that, folks. I'm sorry if it's boring, but for legal reasons I do. Now, the broader debate and the Guido Fawkes story that you have broken today.
Yes, well, that meeting on the October 31st last year has proved to be quite the disaster for Keir Starmer. We obtained the full hour-long recording of the meeting, and we've obviously got Azza Ali, who went further on the statements that were reported by the Mail, saying that he said it publicly, he'll say it publicly again, that he thinks Netanyahu let the barriers down, let the massacre happen to then retaliate against Gaza. But present also at the meeting, as we discovered, was Graham Jones, who is former Labour MP for Hindburn, 20 miles north of Rochdale, northwest. He was MP there from 2010 to 2019 when he was booted out by the Tories, but he's currently the prospective parliamentary candidate for Labour yet again this year. So what he said at this meeting is that I'm terribly sorry. He said that the Brits who go to Israel to fight with the Israeli Defence Forces should be locked up, and that fucking... I'm terribly sorry. Pre-watershed.
You get me sacked. Go on.
And effing Israel has... he said effing Israel twice, essentially.
Yeah.
So what we see here is the same sort of sentiment that's been festering in local Labour constituency party meetings for quite some time. And you've got to remember, it was 4 years ago that Starmer took the helm on the ticket of get in, let's purge the Corbynites. And we're now 2 days out from 2 by-elections, 2 weeks out from a crucial by-election in Rochdale, and we've got a candidate getting deselected for this.
And the lack of objection to what was said at that meeting in a room full of Labour Party members was what I found astonishing.
Pure assent.
That's what I found astonishing.
Absolutely. So, Nigel, there's 2 things. First of all, every single person who was in that room, apart from obviously it might reveal who recorded it, but it should be suspended instantly. So we need to... Labour Party meetings, you know, we have to sign in for the minutes, and they should be suspended straight away, because if you don't stand up...
But the truth is the truth.
Yeah, you know. but can I just say what is even more interesting about Nigel, and frankly even more worrying about him, is that he is Graham, sorry. He is a decent... Graham, I've always thought was a decent bloke. He's one of the very few working class Labour MPs used to print the Manchester Evening News. Yeah. He's very critical of my boss, let alone Jeremy Corbyn. He's on the right of the Labour Party. He doesn't believe it. He was saying it to play into the room, because we don't know exactly... When I first heard, I see this was a kind of general meeting of Lancashire councillors. This, to me, sounds like it was a meeting exclusively of Muslim Labour members. It would have been community leaders, that famous phrase, and people would have been playing to the gallery. Graham would have been playing to the gallery to try and secure...
So you've almost just admitted it. The Labour Party can't really change too much, can it?
Well,
it relies on Muslim votes to such a large degree.
That's what I think I think what's happened is that the sort of left anti-Semitism that Corbyn represented, which tended to be from white, sort of no religion lefties, that has actually been really clamped down on. It was very obvious. People were tweeting away about it, and those people have left in droves, partly because of anti-Semitism, because they've been kicked out, but also they've also had enough. But what we need to stop in the Labour Party now is this kind of bartering of community politics. We should talk to the Muslim voters, we should engage with the Muslim voters, but we've got to stop going to meetings, even if we're not talking about it, and sort of having sort of block votes. But I did meetings with Ed where we'd have, there would be 200 Muslims in the room, and not far from there, and everybody wanted a picture taken, and they'd all be blokes. And that was it. It was basically a photo op. It was literally, we just literally went. It was one of the scariest experiences. People were surging forward to get their picture taken, and you had to take certain people first on the nods from locals. Nothing dodgy was said at those meetings at all. It was all, it was all sort of jolly.
The Labour Party,
it's that kind of community.
The Labour Party have a problem.
They do. But let me just give you another example. It's not only the Labour Party that does it. There's a Tory MP in Peterborough, Paul Bristow, who he's employed somebody in his office who the Labour Party kicked out for anti-Semitism. That's been as reported by the Jewish Chronicle, and he said he wasn't going to sack him. I don't know if he sacked him in the last few weeks, but this is when it was reported.
I tell you what, we'll get him on the programme.
Yes.
Max, thank you. Folks, I've been doing this 2.5 years. We've never had a word like that used. It was used in error, and I'm sorry if any of your kids watching it or you are offended by it. In a moment, you'll never guess, the Prime Minister is going to build lots of houses on brownfield sites. I think I've heard that at every general election for the last 20 years. Is there any particular reason to believe that this time it really is going to happen?
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
delicious?
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's sake,
basically,
civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes, something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
Yeah.
But I'm all right with people, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
Well, do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying, rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
So has the Labour Party changed? I don't doubt, actually, honestly, that Keir Starmer has tried to change it, but it doesn't look very changed to me. Some of your reactions. Gary says, this isn't a changed Labour Party. This is a party where the usual big mouths have been silenced pre-election. You just wait and see what happens if they win. Another says, same old for Labour. It was inevitable. John says Labour has not changed. Starmer has tried to hide and keep a lid on anti-Semitism, but he's failed. John, to be fair to Keir Starmer, you know, he has actually kicked people out of the party. He stopped Jeremy Corbyn from standing again. He might have dithered a bit. He might have dithered for a day or so when it came to the by-election in Rochdale, but in the end he did act. He has actually, I mean, to be fair to him, I think he's actually tried. I just think this stuff is so deep-rooted within the Labour Party, and I think their reliance on what has been that bloc Muslim vote, and I say that because something like 85% of Muslim voters have been voting Labour. Their reliance on it is so great that I think they're going to find it very difficult. And if they want to kick people out who are deeply critical of Israel and their behaviour, I'm not sure in some of the inner city areas they'll have anybody left. Now, when it comes to housing, I remember in 2015, when I was a party leader in the general election debates, housing coming up. And I raised the issue. Did anybody think that the massive rise in population due to immigration had perhaps contributed to the housing problem? Oh, no, they all said. Got nothing to do with it. We're not building enough houses. Well, you know what? Even without immigration, we might be struggling to build enough houses. With immigration running at current levels, it is impossible. But Sunak has got this target of 300,000 houses a year. I'm not sure this year it'll be even more than 200,000 houses that are built, according to developers that I've spoken to. But now a big pledge to build on brownfield sites. Well, folks, we hear this at every election. I think when it comes to building houses, it'll be difficult to tell the difference, frankly, between Labour and the Conservatives. But will it actually happen? Well, I'm joined by James Ugel, External Affairs Manager for Priced Out. Tell us, James, what Priced Out is.
So Priced Out is Britain's largest campaign for making housing affordable again. And the way we do this, simply put, is to liberalise the planning system, as has been promised time and time again by politicians, and to build some more bloody houses.
Yeah, we're having trouble with language tonight with everybody, but that's all. We'll just about allow you that one. But we keep hearing this, don't we? We keep hearing of housing targets that have not been met. I've been told again and again that a series of EU directives on nitrates, for example, but other things, make it so difficult, so expensive to build new houses, particularly in country areas. Anything that's within what's seen as a catchment area of a river suddenly becomes very difficult, very expensive to build. And yes, of course, we want to have environmental concerns. You know, then you've got local councils objecting. People call it NIMBYism, but hey, people don't want a huge number of houses built in their backyard. Is that why Sunak has now settled on brownfield development?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the Labour Party's recent talk about it. There's been a lot of talk from the Labour Party, and some of it really quite positive about, pledging to build more houses, about bulldozing, NIMBYs out of the way and actually getting some houses built. Now, obviously, we need to see the details and we need to see this actually happen before any of us can get a bit too ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I can safely say that the Conservative Party's increased volume has been a direct result of the Labour Party's.
Right, so it is, it's tit for tat, it's election time. What about, importantly, the feasibility of brownfield development? Because a lot of brownfield sites would have been industrial sites, they might have been chemical plants. It's not straightforward, is it?
No, brownfield is notoriously really difficult to actually build on. And I don't think there's anything wrong with necessarily a brownfield first policy, but I think the issue comes into play when people start talking about a brownfield only policy. Because the situation is at the moment, we've got what we call greenfield, and I like to say that greenfield is probably the best marketing trick of the 20th century, because what it's convinced people is that greenfield is just this illustrious, beautiful, green British countryside, when the reality is actually a vast quantity is run-down petrol stations, it's abandoned farms, it is really just urban decay that you've never seen before. And, Siobhan McDonagh from the Labour Party has done an excellent job at highlighting that. And the reality is, when people say, oh, let's start building on greenfield, that doesn't mean we start building on countryside, it means we want to start building where we can.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments that's been put is that post-1945, one of the solutions is, obviously, there was a huge amount of rebuilding needed to be, 30% of London's housing stock severely damaged, etc. Prefabs, of course, were actually quite effective. I'm not suggesting we go back to them, but they were quite effective. But the concept of new towns, the Crawleys, etc., leading on later on to the Milton Keyneses, is perhaps the answer to start thinking about new towns.
Sure, well, there's been a lot of talk about new towns.
Labour have talked about it.
For sure. A lot of Conservative MPs really like the idea as well. They looked at Poundbury as a really good example of that. And I think the type of houses that come out of Poundbury are beautiful. But the reality is what we need right now is we need more houses in cities, especially London and the South East, and because that's where the jobs are, that's where the infrastructure is. If you're going to start building towns in the middle of nowhere, but there's no jobs, no infrastructure, you'll find that people actually buying those houses don't really need them.
Veteran journalist Simon Jenkins has made an argument for some years that if you look at the density of housing in terms of how many people are living per square foot, that actually a vast amount of London was built as suburbia, giving people lots of room and quite big gardens, and that we have one of the lowest densities of population in London compared to our rival cities of whether it's Berlin or Paris or whatever it may be. Could the answer in London and some of our cities, and yes, brownfield's part of it, is the answer to build up?
You know what? Building up is absolutely fantastic. A lot of people are calling for mansards to be built, which are really, really fantastic things because it keeps it in line with, community character and all that, which is, probably number one of the NIMBY excuses as why we shouldn't be building X, Y and Z. And so, we really can build beautifully. And a really good example of that is Create Streets. And they're a group who will regularly put out, just fantastic ideas and fantastic plans of ways that we can build beautifully in London and the South East. And that's where we really need to be building. In London and the South East, those are the most unaffordable areas. And this is a supply and demand problem, as I'm sure you'll know.
Is any of it actually going to happen, James?
God, I wish I could give you a good answer. I wish I could give you a good answer, Nigel.
But I think you've actually given me the answer I wanted tonight. That Rishi Sunak has said, and thank you for joining me on the programme. I think what James said there was very insightful indeed, that the big brownfield push we're getting from Rishi Sunak is in direct response to what's been said by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. And folks, you will see just so much more of this between now and the general election where they try to match each other. In fact, it might even get to the point where you literally can't tell them apart on policy. In a moment, we'll have a look at the law of unintended consequences, a tough piece of legislation pushed through by Suella Braverman as Home Secretary has actually left us now with 22,000 migrants totally in limbo and a daily bill for hotels of £1.5 million.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
I appreciate the story isn't in today's papers, but it has been running all week, and it's
Yes.
this row over the use of nitrogen hypoxia to kill this man who was on death row in Alabama.
Alabama, yeah.
And it's been linked back to you, and I wanted to ask you about it because this is intriguing, because you did a television show back in 2015 where you, I believe, tested this method of execution. Just tell me briefly about it, Michael. What happened?
I didn't test this method of execution, and it was a bit longer ago than that. But what I did do was test hypoxia. So I tested various ways in which people are killed in the United States, and asked the question as to whether there was a more humane way of doing it. So I was put into hypoxic situations, for example, into a chamber run by the Netherlands Air Force, which simulated what happens if you're in an aircraft at 30,000 feet and suddenly the windows blow out. And what happened to me was that I was almost instantly rendered incapable. As an experiment, I was trying to play with children's toys, putting triangle shapes into triangle spaces, and I was quickly unable to do that. I was asked, what is 9 minus 5? And I said 5. And then the officer who was with me, the Air Force officer who was wearing an oxygen mask, said to me, Michael, put your mask on or you will die. And I was incapable of putting my own mask on. Now, this suggested that hypoxia was very fast acting.
Yeah.
And that you had... Obviously, I was in no pain or anything like that. I was just completely unaware. By the way, this is why, if you're on an aircraft and it depressurizes, you must put your own mask on first. But of course, I can't go on and draw conclusions.
No.
We did not experiment with nitrogen. But what I can say is it was evident to me that hypoxia renders you incapable almost instantaneously.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are going to do something. Yes, we are going to pass legislation. The 7th of March 2023, the Prime Minister stood up and said, we're going to put forward the Illegal Migration Bill, which in July of that year became the Illegal Migration Act. And after that, if you come into this country, you will be detained, you will be deported, you will not be able to stay. It all sounded very tough and very strong. And Suella Braverman was the Home Secretary. Her job was to pilot this through Parliament. But sometimes tough talk and legislation can lead to an outcome quite unlike that was planned at the beginning, because it would seem that those that came between the 7th of March 2023 and the passing of the legislation on the 20th of July, something like 22,000 people came, 11,000 of them across the English Channel, another 11,000 with poor documentation or with reasons that they shouldn't really have been coming into the country. And it turns out that they are now stuck in some sort of legal limbo land, costing us £1.5 million a year. They can't really apply for asylum. We can't really get rid of them. It seems we're in a bit of a legal mess. At least Richard Bartram, senior immigration solicitor, I think that's the position.
Well, it is, to a degree, that the whole Rwanda thing was a little bit of a distraction. That was all about your asylum case is going to be processed in Rwanda. What this is about is that your asylum case won't be processed at all and you will be removed. But you only have to go 3 sections in to see that, because it's on the first page. So how that's going to work in practice, we don't know yet, because Section 3, we can change the dates, any of those dates at any time by statutory instrument. The Home Office are in a bit of a bind because they they're waiting for, I suppose, the political will to start deeming cases inadmissible, and that's where the bun fight starts between the judges, the lawyers, the Home Office, the politicians. But the Legal Migration Act, the purpose is to deter illegal migration, yes, but it also goes on to the whole point being to provide the safe and legal routes. Now, in the Act, and it's actually in the Act, the Secretary of State must, not should, could, would, must publish the legal routes, access to the legal routes, etc. So at the same time as people who have come over on small boats have their claims deemed inadmissible or removed, one should expect, if all the provisions of the Act are implemented equally, well, that provision is implemented, it's law as it is, we may expect, I don't know, the kind of Afghan Windrush flag sailing out of Karachi with 5,000 asylum seekers on it. Well, there won't be. There'll be asylum grants, presumably by UK Border Force in Pakistan.
Yeah.
But we don't know anything about that. But the two go in hand. They're the yin and the yang here. So where we end up, well, for the moment, the Home Office are... we have the tactical surge team throwing out decisions left, right and centre to bring that backlog down. And then there's always wiggle room in legislation, special circumstances.
But was this do you think this was rush legislation that wasn't very well thought through?
I certainly don't think it came out of the Home Office. And with respect to the Home Office, I do have some respect for their senior caseworkers and presenting officers.
I thought it was not fit for purpose.
They can only work with the tools given to them. And this is the tool that they've been given. So even with this tool, the Illegal Migration Act, the guidance actually takes a step back and looks at reasonable excuses for not claiming asylum in a third country. That's before we even get to the ins and outs of decades of legislation, literally decades of legislation on, say, third countries. So there are some good things in here, some things that I might personally disagree with. The creation of safe and legal routes has never been done, never been tried. It's actually extraordinary, and if it works, it's an absolute game changer.
Would it reduce numbers or increase numbers?
Well, it would put us in control of numbers.
Yeah.
Because there's that provision as well, and it would allow us to target the places where, the near borders where refugees are coming from, rather than who's got the money to pay $10,000 to a trafficker to bring them over.
I have to say, I'm sceptical that numbers would come down, but who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? As it is. The other fascination with this piece of legislation is there was a Home Affairs Committee meeting 2-3 weeks ago. James Cleverly was there, and a couple of senior civil servants were with him. Rycroft, very, very senior, was with him. And the question was asked by Tim Loughton, Tory MP for Worthing. He said, what has happened to all the people who've come since the passing of the Illegal Migration Act? Namely, what has happened to all those that have crossed the Channel since July the 20th? And Rycroft admitted that nearly all of them are claiming asylum. It's as if we've passed a piece of legislation, but nothing's changed.
Well, he's correct. At the end of the day, I suppose it's going to be a political decision as much as a legal decision when to push the button on this.
Yes.
And
political will, which you mentioned earlier on.
And when push comes, I'm going to use this when push comes to shove, but do we have the ferries? No, to remove people. Do we have the planes? No. And the reality is that the human traffickers already own all the dinghies. So where are we going with that?
But with political will, we could, you never know, just about move mountains. Richard Bartram, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Oh dear, what a complete and utter mess it all is, despite the fine words that we were hearing from a Prime Minister and indeed from a Home Secretary. Now, the What the Farage moment today really does come. Do you remember the first protest that we saw in London, the first Palestinian protest we saw in London, and we saw 3 women wearing these paraglider images on their backs? This was very shortly after the horrendous offences that had been committed by paragliders at that youth and music festival that took place in Israel, and it caused outrage. Well, they have, I'm pleased to say, been in court, and they have, by a jury, been found guilty of a terror offence. That terror offence being supporting a banned organisation, namely Hamas. And yet, as the trio lowered their heads and wept in the dock as the verdict was read out. They were spared jail after the judge decided their lesson had been well learned and gave them a 12-month conditional discharge. It almost seems to me that we have a judge here who's gone against the guilty verdict of the jury. Maybe I've made a controversial comment, maybe I'll be slammed for saying it, but that's how it looks to me, and I don't feel comfortable about it at all. Now, a thought today for a fellow broadcaster, and really, I think quite a legendary broadcaster. Steve Wright had been at the BBC since the 1970s. One of those voices around forever, over 40 years, on Radio 1, on Radio 2. For the last few years, nearly 20 years, it had been Steve Wright in the afternoon on Radio 2, and I think all of us at some point had listened to it. He also, was presenting a Sunday morning show, which he was still doing. And Steve Wright has died today at the age of 69. We don't know what the cause of death was. And, too often the word is used, somebody was good at this or great at that. But actually, tell you what, I appeared a few times on that Steve Wright show. I was interviewed by him. And that combination of doing light entertainment and music, but also adding in thoughtful current affairs, is not an easy combination to get right. And Steve Wright really did do it superbly. Radio 2, which, has been, for many, many years now, the most listened to radio station across the whole of Europe, and one of the most listened to in the world, believe it or not. But Steve Wright being shoved out of the afternoon slot, Ken Bruce being removed with his Popmaster quiz from the mid-morning slot, has seen them lose an awful, awful lot of listeners. Having said that, if you want current affairs, GB News Radio, now in some parts of the country, is beating all the others when it comes to current affairs. You haven't just got to watch us, you can listen to us in your car or wherever you are with a DAB radio. Now, after I came off air last night, Rishi Sunak was there, up in the northeast of England, taking on an audience in the People's Forum. In a moment, we're going to do a bit of post-match analysis. I'll be joined by the editor of the Express Online, David Maddox. Did he perform well? Did he do enough? And is that 25-point, trail in the polls, is it even possible he can turn it around? Did last night begin a positive process?
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m.
Why are the people who are in charge, who told us all to do the right thing, have left us all to rot?
The vaccine injured are still being demonised. The victim that won't be silenced, John Watt, joins me in a TV exclusive. Plus, after the Azhar Ali chaos in Rochdale, I interview Shamima Begum's lawyer, who is standing against a Labour MP on a pro-Palestine ticket. And is the PM right that a vote for reform is a vote for Sir Keir Starmer? Nigel Farage is live responding. That's Patrick Christie's tonight. It's 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment, and the bureaucracy, and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police, and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under, and of course the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force, and it's clearly a problem with the Home Secretary, who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, GB News has branded itself the election channel, and that is exactly what we intend to be on what is going to be an incredibly busy year and a very long general election campaign. We're becoming rather like America, where the campaign sort of lasts for almost up to a year. So I thought last night's event, the People's Forum with the Prime Minister, was a great idea. Survation, the polling company we used, to find an audience of 100 people who were undecided. And it was very interesting. After the programme, after the show, you know, Chris Hope stood there, our political editor, and he must have interviewed 10, 20 people coming out, and it was clear most of them had gone in there as genuinely undecided voters. So I think as a piece of television, it actually worked incredibly well because it did exactly what it said on the tin. I also think it's a good thing because why would any other party leader be scared of coming on to a GB News' People Forum, knowing that actually we're doing it by the book and making it as fair as we possibly can. Rishi Sunak wasn't challenged particularly in the sense that the people asked the questions, they didn't get the chance to come back. I was disappointed we didn't get debate on legal immigration, on the population explosion, but many other issues were discussed. Interestingly, vaccine harms seemed to bring the most passion out of the audience and put the Prime Minister in the most difficult position. But whilst he's absolutely competent at doing this, and there's no doubt, and he's in control, and he comes across as being perfectly polite and perfectly reasonable, it's all pretty robotic. And you've heard all the answers before. And the tactic is just to keep repeating the same lines over and over again. Did it do enough to convince people? And given that in the last 48 hours, we've had two opinion polls, one putting the Conservatives on 22% of the national vote share, and another putting them on 21% of the vote share. Goodness gracious me. I actually think he needs something spectacular to turn this around. Well, David Maddox, political editor of The Express Online, is a seasoned observer of these things. I mean, the 5 pledges, it would appear that is the sort of centrepiece of his pitch, isn't it?
Well, it is, unfortunately. I mean, we may be going backwards on the 5 pledges this week. We await the inflation figures, whether we're going into recession. The NHS stuff, as was touched on twice, I think, last night, is clearly concerning people as well. And of course, we didn't get a question on immigration, but you know, the small boats have not been stopped.
Well, the reminder did come up, but the sheer number of people coming into the country didn't. What about, I mean, we can come back to some detail, and I will, because Jacob's here as well, of what he mentioned. But what about his style? You know, we are living in an age when television image, when how you look on Twitter or X or whatever it may be, you know, how you come across, whether you look and sound like a leader matters. Let's have a look at Rishi Sunak in action last night.
Inflation has been more than halved, from 11% when I got this job to around 4% now. The economy's outperformed expectations. Debt is on track to fall, and because of all of that, we've been able to start cutting taxes. The number of illegal migrants crossing the Channel is down by 1/3 last year. And although, of course, there are challenges in the NHS, we've eliminated the longest waits, people waiting 2 years or a year and a half. And that is progress.
So he's very good. I mean, he's good at putting a spin on things, isn't he? But is that inspiring? It's competent, but is it inspiring?
I thought that format worked quite well for him.
It was good for him.
It was good for him. He looked personable. The audience clearly warmed him, and we saw that in the, the result of the polling of the audience afterwards. And he did well there. It brought out the strengths in him because that's what he is. He's a competent, personable individual who's actually very pleasant to talk to on a one-to-one basis, and that kind of gave you the impression of his one-to-one Rishi, if you like. I think he was clearly very nervous, and I picked up in my analysis piece afterwards, the number of times he said "right" as a full stop is a kind of.
And did you know his mum was a chemist? Did you know that?
But I mean, of course, it's as old as time that politicians will repeat the same lines which work. Yeah. It's like Labour has no plan. They know that's working as an attack line. Jacob will know that better than I because he's been at the forefront of it. You have to pick the lines which work.
But where was the knockout line? Where was the thing that was said last night that would have them talking in the offices this morning when they all arrived for work?
That's my issue with it, is that they are so far behind that whilst something like that won't have done him any harm, it will have done him a bit of good. It's not the big thing that's going to turn things around. They need to do something much more dramatic, much more of a flourish, really. I mean, some of his MPs, some of your colleagues, Jacob, were suggesting that he brought you a membership card, before this.
He's not going to do that.
No, he's not going to do that now. But he's like, but just something to change the narrative. And, at the moment, they're relying on Labour imploding, I think.
Yeah. It was interesting, Jacob, wasn't it? That we've got the 5 pledges and Stop the Boats has now become fewer people came last. And he puts a spin on everything, and I guess you could argue everybody in politics does to a certain extent. But it's almost as if there is sort of a grid that's been established. This is how we're going to fight the general election. Labour will take us back to square one. We are making progress. Sounds a bit like Cameron in 2015, actually, in some ways. But is he really a leader?
But you've got the message, haven't you? Labour will take us back to square one. Labour hasn't got a plan.
Good. I want to go back to square one. Everything's going wrong.
I think people are crying out for competence. I think that is important, and that is his advantage. And we see Labour in a complete mess over the last few days.
What, the Tory party's not?
But the Labour Party was trying to win the election by doing absolutely nothing. Complete inertia and thinking we'll be fine because the Tories aren't very popular. If in the next 6 months Rishi Sunak can show, look, I'm competent, I'm listening, I can actually meet voters and make reasonable points and be understood by them and relate to them, which I thought he did very well last night, and Starmer is dealing with another anti-Semitic row, which he was slow to answer, looked like the Corbyn days of Labour, then suddenly Labour's strategy of just sitting there like a fat Buddha ceases to work.
The one slight problem with all of this, I'm going to build houses and I'm going to reduce immigration and I'm going to do X, Y and Z, is you've been promising this at election after election for the last 14 years. If you haven't done it yet, why on earth should we believe you now?
Because in terms of house building, there have been some years when we've achieved significant house building. So it's not as if it's always been bad. It's been difficult in the last couple of years. Coming out of COVID, it's been very slow. We haven't had the reform of the planning system that I would like to see. I mean, I think the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act is a reason why you should never vote Labour. It is classic socialist planning that doesn't work.
I'm not sure 1947 is very high in many people's minds, but maybe it is, Jacob, maybe it is. But the point I'm making is, whether it's housing or whatever it is, I think people are now out there. And I tried in 2015 to make a connection between a rapidly rising population and a problem with public services and houses. And I now think the British public have got that message. I'll just go to David on that. It seems to me the connection between housing, GP appointments and a population that's 10 million higher than when Labour came to power. People know this now, don't they?
Yes, they do. They do. And that's why immigration is such a big issue. I mean, it's clearly why immigrate. I mean, if you live in London or one of the cities, you certainly live in my part of London, in the East End. It's an enormous issue because most people will have a house on their street which has 20 people living in it, and things like that. They won't be able to get a GP appointment. They won't be able to, they've been told to go and wait for 5 hours a day in for something minor, and it's ridiculous.
I mean, 2010, 2015, 2017. All those manifestos said we will reduce net migration to tens of thousands. The 2019 manifesto was worded slightly differently, but the wording was very clear that immigration numbers were going to come down. They have exploded, Jacob. Isn't that the one thing where it's very, very difficult to believe anything Rishi says?
Actually, no, I think you're very unfair to him.
Really?
Yes, he took the decision late last year to reduce legal migration and to make it much more difficult against very heavy pressure from the Treasury mandarins and the OBR. I'm afraid to say, if you want to blame the rise in migration, legal migration, the candidate you've got to point the finger at is my old friend Boris Johnson. It's not Rishi Sunak on this occasion.
No, you're right.
Rishi's putting it right.
No,
I would like him to go further. Because I think legal migration is the big problem.
So do you actually think legal migration in 2024 will be in the tens of thousands?
No.
No, nor do I.
No.
And that's the point.
But it was 1.4 million over the 2 years to the middle of 2023. It has got to come down massively from that level. And we've got to tighten it up. Part of our productivity problem is that we have been using the drug of cheap overseas labour, and it's been disastrous for us.
Every economist, Jacob, told us that actually this would increase our productivity.
Which is nonsense.
And if you look at it since 2004 in particular, actually an excess of cheap foreign labour has done nothing for our productivity or whatever. Jacob, what's your main focus tonight?
We're going to be talking about Labour, its anti-Semitism problem, what's gone on with their candidate, with Mr Ali, and how they failed to act for so long.
Nightmare day for Starmer.
Terrible day for Starmer. Actually, if by some miracle the Conservatives do win the next election, I think we can date the beginning of the end for the Labour Party on October the 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel, because it's really sent that party into a spin.
It really has. Well, as I said earlier on in this show, I think the Rochdale by-election that comes up at the end of this month is going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm back with you tomorrow night, live here at 7 o'clock in the studio. Before all of that, let's have a look and see what the weather has got in store for us.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again, very good evening to you. Alex Burkill here with your latest GB News weather forecast. Yes, across Scotland it is going to be a chilly night with some frost likely, but for most of us it's a cloudy, wet and mild story because of a weather system that pushed its way in earlier today and has already brought a fair amount of rain across many parts of England and Wales, staying cloudy and wet across many parts through the night, and rain also pushing into Northern Ireland too as we go through the early hours of tomorrow morning. However, across much of Scotland, clear skies here, and with that then temperatures taking a bit of a drop, falling a few degrees below freezing, so a fairly harsh frost here, but much milder elsewhere where we have those cloudy skies. As we go through tomorrow itself then, another grey gloomy day for most of us. Further outbreaks of rain could be heavy, could turn persistent for a time in the south, and some persistent rain pushing in then across parts of Scotland with some snow over the highest ground. Greatest chance of seeing any sunshine tomorrow will be in the far north of Scotland, but here's where it's also going to be chilliest. Elsewhere, a pretty mild day with highs of around 14 or 15 Celsius. Mild for most on Thursday, could be even milder than on Wednesday, but again cloudy with further outbreaks of rain, and these could be pretty heavy at times. Could see some localised impacts. Notice some heavier rain pushing into the south as we go into the afternoon. At the moment, Friday does look like it will be drier with some bright or sunny spells, but then the rain returns in time for Saturday. Bye-bye, I'll see you again soon.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. First of all, it's a pleasure to be back. I thought Rishi Sunak was an admirable stand-in, but as the Labour Party withdraws its support for the Rochdale by-election candidate, as